Good afternoon all, and welcome to the latest in YouGov's COVID-19 webinar series. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Will Alstein, and I'm joined today by YouGov's UK Head of Account Management, Amelia Brophy. Good afternoon, Amelia.
Hi, Will. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Fabulous.
Before we go any further, just a little bit of housekeeping, if I may. We're on voice only this afternoon, just to preserve bandwidth. Questions, if you do have any questions during this webinar or at the end, we've switched on the chat function. So please do just jot your questions down. We've got, I have allowed for time at the end so that we can get through as many of those as possible. And that's the really fun bit for us. So please do contribute to them. We're also recording this webinar. And we will share a full copy of the deck afterwards. So please don't feel as though you have to scribble endless notes. We will distribute a full set of slides either this afternoon or early next week. Right, let's crack on. So what are we going to cover in the next 45 minutes? I'm just going to give a brief overview of YouGov's work on COVID-19 and how we've been working to help serve the public good, which is our primary mission, but also just explain a little more about the types of data sets that we've been creating. I'm then going to hand over to Amelia, who's going to walk through the insights from our commercial data sets. So looking at our consumer monitor and looking at our economic recovery tracker. I'm then going to come back a little bit at the end to give an even more topical update. Following the government announcement on Tuesday, we've collected some new data since then, just to get a gauge of the UK population's response to that. I'll touch on future developments at the end, and then we'll get on to your questions. So, without further ado, YouGov's work on COVID-19, what have we been doing? Well, Stefan Shakespeare, our global CEO, was very, very clear at the breakout of the pandemic. He said that our overriding mission was to serve the public good. And what does he mean by that? Well, what he means is giving everybody around the world the opportunity to contribute to the discussion and have their voice heard. We've then been busy aggregating that data into a meaningful data set and delivering it to organizations that can make a difference. So that's governments, that's public health bodies, but it's also anyone that wants access to our public or behavioral data. And I'm going to use those terms throughout this presentation because we've created, in a sense, 3 data sets. Our behavioral data is that's designed for public health organizations and policymakers. It's been run in conjunction with Imperial College London and is open source. It's available to all. We then have our public data. So this is, again, is designed for everyone. It's available on YouGov's website, and the links to both our website and where you can find the open source behavioral data is also there. And then we have our consumer trackers. Let me delve a little bit more into what I mean by each of those data sets. So our behavioral data, it's been created in association with Imperial College London. In particular, the Institute for Global Health Innovation, which is a world-leading center for epidemiology. And it's also one of the many university hospitals that is leading the race around the world to create a vaccine. And in conjunction with our advisors there, what we've done is create a global survey panning 29 markets that really tries to understand the population in terms of their behavior, their concerns, their trust, and most importantly, their understanding and readiness to comply with government policy. And then armed with that data, governments and policymakers can then make much better decisions on their policy, better decisions on the way and the channels through which they communicate with the population at large. So data in this instance are being used by governments, by public health bodies, by agencies such as the World Health Organization around the world. And for the first time, YouGov has made this data open source. You can get your hands on the data through two routes. It's available on GitHub. For those that require it, for those that can use it, that comes in row-level format. So it's the completely flat data files that you are more than welcome to go and explore and download and use as you wish. For those that prefer dashboarding, at Imperial College's COVID Data Hub.com, you will find dashboards of this behavioral data powered by Tableau. YouGov's public data, again, available to all. There was a dedicated area of our website. It's available at yougov.co.uk/COVID-19. And what we've done there is take a selection of what we believe are KPIs or really interesting data points from our commercial trackers around fear, around government handling, around impact on personal finances, and made those available publicly and free to anyone. Those charts are completely interactive. You can drill down into individual markets, individual regions, or you can all look at all 27 countries that we're covering. In terms of the number of surveys, that's just gone through 500,000 and is counting all the time. For our data subscribers, so for clients that have access to Brandindex or YouGov Profiles, what we've also done is take a number of data points from our COVID trackers and upload them into those tools. So that gives you the ability to drill into particular COVID audiences or view your brand and its performance through the lens of various COVID audiences. If you are a subscriber and need help finding those variables, please contact the client management team and they'll be delighted to help you. If you're not familiar with these tools, but you think they might sound interesting, either from an audience planning perspective, consumer segmentation and understanding, or to help you track your brand and monitor campaign performance, please do reach out to us, info@yougov.com, or you can look us up online. Right, our commercial data sets. So what Amelia is going to run through is our consumer monitor and our economic recovery monitor. The consumer monitor was launched in the UK on the 12th of March. It was actually launched in some APAC markets about a month earlier, in the middle of February. But we grew the scope of our tracking, adding markets as the pandemic spread around the world. And what we cover in here are levels of concern. And what we mean by that is perceptions of the situation both nationally and globally. The impact of COVID-19, government's handling of the virus, whether people have sufficient information, crucially, trust. And I know this, Amelia's got some particularly interesting charts on who we trust. Then we look at changes in spend, looking at online versus in store. We've also got data in there on eating and dining behaviors. And we also cover media consumption, not only in terms of channel, but crucially also in terms of content. In our economic recovery monitor, we launched this at the beginning of May. As the virus developed, we thought, actually, let's look at what the bounce is going to look like. Is it going to be a rapid recovery? Is it going to be more of a gradual growth, or worse, is it going to remain flat or contract? And in order to do that, what we've done is gain a view of consumer confidence and the impact that the virus and the lockdown measures and things like furlough have had on them and their households. So we look at existing financial household situation and a view to that in the future. There's also some more fun questions in there about how someone might use a windfall. Lovely way of teasing out actually really how households are feeling at the moment. We look at levels of employment, we look at business activity, and then we're looking into more of the future, the YouGov crystal ball, if you like, where we've tried to look at what are the future consumer habits that are developing, or what are the macro trends that COVID-19 has actually accelerated. So things like, for example, working from home, the use of cash, traveling for work, etc. So that is what, in those last two charts, what our commercial data sets cover. Amelia is going to give you a tour of that data. Now, by all means, we're not able to cover all of it in the timeline, nor are we able to drill in depth into all types of audiences that we might, you as our clients might be interested in. But if you are interested in drilling further, again, please contact your local account team or drop us a line at info@yougov.com. Right, enough of me. On to Amelia. Amelia, who is our UK Head of Account Management, and she's going to walk us through the data that I've just described. Amelia.
Great, thank you, Will. So we're going to look at a selection of data from the Consumer Monitor and from the Economic Recovery Tracker. If you want to move on to the next slide, you can see that we've been collecting data for the Consumer Monitor since early March. So we've now got around 14 waves of data that we're looking at. We've been running it out each week to around 2,000 NAT rep. So we've been building up that base over time. Most of the data that we're looking at here today, we're looking at on a UK NAT rep basis, so looking at the UK population as a whole. But because we've been building that data and that sample up over time, we are able to drill down into much smaller segments of the population, whether this be based on things like geographies, also to understand how different demographic groups or social groups are responding to this data. So, you know, as Will mentioned, if you are a subscriber or you are buying this data, please get in touch with us if you'd like us to drill down, or we do have some other options that are available on our website where you can also play with the data a little bit there as well. So if we go on to the next slide, Will, I think as I was going through this data and building out the story, and we've been looking at this a lot since the beginning of March, I think what really stands out to me is the UK we've been in lockdown for a long time. And so we're starting to see that there's a lot of the things that we're measuring that have stayed the same, particularly over the last couple of weeks. But what I want to highlight is some significant shifts in how people are thinking and feeling about our response and about our future that I think you know, offer some real insight into what people are doing and what people are going to want to do in the near future. So here we're looking just at what people think about the UK's progress and our progress with COVID-19. So the majority of us do think that the UK is getting better, but you can see that that fluctuates quite a lot from week to week. And while we reached a peak towards the end of May, going into the May bank holiday, we had a lot of positivity with 3 out of 4 of us feeling like things were getting better, that this dropped off quite a lot from the next week. And so, you know, people are still feeling, I think, that external events are impacting them a lot, and that the mood is likely to change, and therefore the view of our progress is likely to change as different kind of events impact people's individual circumstances. If we then move on to the next slide and have a look at how this compares with the global situation, we see that this is a lot more steady than the situation in the UK. So about half of us think that global progress is that we are getting better, and that's stayed around the same for the last 3 waves of data. And I think, that's interesting that when we roll it all up, while we might see that there's individual countries that are doing better or worse, that when we kind of have it all rolled up into one, about half of us do think that things are getting better. If we then have a look at the government's handling of the situation. So this is looking specifically not about whether the situation for the UK is getting better, but what the government specifically have done to handle that situation. We've talked a lot about this data because it's been such a big driver of behavioural change, is how people are viewing the government and the direction that is coming from the government. And we saw that for most of the, all of the first block, that overall people felt like the government's handling of the situation, that more of people felt that they were handling it well than that we're handling it badly. We saw that switch over in early May, and we now have more people thinking that the government has handled the situation badly than well. That is tracked with reports of the increasing death toll. And interesting, when we look at this compared to some other markets, like the USA, we see that the US made that switch in viewing that their government was handling things poorly a couple of weeks before us, and that the UK and the US are down there in the top 5 countries, bottom 5 countries globally in terms of the perceived response from the government, and then the positive sentiment towards that government handling of COVID-19. So it really has not reflected well on the government here, and we've seen that then impacts into how people are feeling about the government and the information that's coming from the government. So one of the things that's really important, and over the course of these webinar series, we've talked about the public health response. We've talked about how it's important for people to have trust in the government to then follow the guidance that is being offered by the government as well. And what we've seen is that in line with a kind of decrease in how well we think the government is handling the situation, we're also seeing a decrease in trust for what the government is saying. So if we look at that from the beginning of May until the last couple of weeks, we see that has decreased, by around 10 percentage points over the last few weeks, and that's across all countries as well. And while England does seem to have the highest trust in the government, Wales almost got up there for a while. The kind of shape of those curves is similar across the different countries, and overall it's not a great picture in terms of how people are feeling in general and what their level of trust is about what the government is saying on COVID-19. And just so that we're clear there, even when we're talking about Wales and Scotland, we have specified in the question that we're referring to the UK government specifically. So how does this trust that we're feeling for the government fit in with the trust that we're feeling for other people? We've talked a few times around the perceptions of the NHS and a lot of support for the NHS, and it really being a touchstone for people during this time. And we see in general that healthcare professionals are the most trusted group. And that's across everyone, both those who think the situation is getting better and those who think the situation is getting worse. After healthcare professionals, it's our friends and family that we're most likely to trust. And the ones that we're least likely to trust across the board is the media. What I think is quite interesting, however, is that we've got 24% of people, so about 1 in 4, who think that the UK situation is getting worse, and they also have the least amount of trust in the government as well. So it's likely that these things are correlated, and they're not feeling like the information they're being given is actually reflecting the situation. So this trust in the media, it's something that we talk about a lot, and we've talked about a lot even before coronavirus, is trust in the media and how that has changed over time. What we saw when kind of quarantine first started and people went into lockdown was that consumption of media of all types went up very quickly. And so what we're seeing is that people are consuming a lot of media, but in general, they're not feeling like the media themselves are a source of information to be trusted on this topic. So if we move forward to the next slide, we can see here that 83% of people feel that they have enough information. We see that, that the information that people are getting, there hasn't been as much change in the last couple of weeks, but still there is an increase in the amount of information that people are getting from general news and content, from TV and from movies, and that in general, people aren't trusting the media as that source of information. So while this isn't a new challenge for the media, I think when we're thinking about changing habits of people, when we're thinking about the impact that COVID-19 is having on people, the impact that it's having on the media and people's trust in the media is something that also needs to be considered. If we can move on to the next slide. So now we're kind of thinking, okay, people are feeling that in general the UK situation is getting better, but the government hasn't done a great job of handling it. We are feeling like we've got enough information, but the information that we're getting from the media and the government isn't necessarily the best. So what's that actually making us think and feel about what's going to happen next? What we're seeing is that, you know, around 3 in 4 of us are worried about the lasting impact on society. About half of us are worried that our finances are going to be severely affected. And 3 in 10 of us are worried that we're going to lose our jobs. So there's a lot of very personal feelings that people are having as a result of how they're thinking and feeling about the government, the news and media that they're consuming and what they're thinking and feeling about that, and then what they think is going to happen to their personal situation and society as well. So there's a lot of worry that we're seeing there, and I think it's really important that we keep all of this in mind as we move into looking at people's spend data, and also then into the economic recovery data. So when we look at the spend data, we saw a really big switch early on in lockdown where we had a lot of people had moved to most of their spend being online. It's not surprising, shops couldn't open, we weren't going to work. Most of the shopping had to be done without us actually leaving our home. As lockdown progressed, we really saw that this kind of stabilized and behavior didn't change much week to week. And I think, you know, really that pattern has continued with the spend in store continuing to decline. But when we look at the overall spend online, so the chart on the right-hand side, what we see in week 6 is there's actually been a small change. And while the majority of people are still saying that there's been no change in their spending, we've had those that have spent more creep into number 2 place for the first time. So this is potentially a positive, that people are feeling like they can spend a little bit more. We've obviously seen that change is only very small, but directionally it is a potential positive that we're seeing in our data. And then if we move on to the next chart, we'll go into some of the economic recovery data now, which also dives a bit more deeper into the financial situation of households and can help us understand some of how people might be thinking about spending their money going forward. Thanks, Will. So despite warnings that the UK economy will be the worst affected in Europe, concerns for a recession remain higher globally than in the UK. So if you have a look at the chart there on the right-hand side, we can see that the net concern number for a global recession at 83% is just a bit higher than that for the UK. And we've got, 68% on the pie chart on the left-hand side who are saying that they think the UK will be in a recession in 12 months' time. So if we move on to the next slide. What does that actually mean? So when we think that, okay, the country's probably going to be in recession in 12 months' time, how's that actually impacting what we do and how we manage our finances? In the short term, what we've seen is that 35% of people have actively reduced non-essential expenses. 34% of people have been looking to save more. We've got just over 1 in 10 people who have relied more on their savings for expenses, but this is 2 percentage points down from the last wave of data. The number of people who have taken on more debt to cover their expenses has stayed stable week to week, and there's just been a small, the people who are saying none of the above is around the same as well. So what we're seeing there is less people who are saying that they're reducing their expenses, less people saying that they've had to rely on their savings to pay for the expenses that they do have. But we also then have a quarter of people, or 22%, who are saying that their household's financial situation is worse compared to a month ago, and then 27% who are saying they're expecting it to be even worse in 12 months' time. So there are some small positives here in terms of, people, a small percentage of people potentially spending a little bit more online, not feeling like they have to cut back so much. But we do still have this really strong kind of quarter of people who are very worried about the future of their household finances and feeling like they're in a worse position than they were a month ago. If we move on then and have a look at how people are feeling about job security. Obviously, your job security and how you're feeling about your household expenses really are very closely linked. What we see is that people feel about the same as they did a month ago. And I think we had a question come through around when this data is from. So the last wave that we're looking at here is the 10th of June. So just before some of the announcements around shops opening and so on. So very much this is people in full lockdown. And we'll have a look at some of the data that we've managed to collect post the announcements about things starting to open up, but this is very much people at the tail end of lockdown. And we have that people who feeling, most people were feeling around the same about their job security as they were a month ago. But in contrast to that, people were actually seeing that there was changes in business level. So there was both increases and decreases, but most people didn't feel like these changes in the business level was necessarily going to impact their job security. We can move on to the next one now. And with that job security, what were people's main concerns and their main concerns about their short-term expenditure? What we've seen is that the highest level concern was about paying bills. So, short-term expenditure where people didn't necessarily have a cushion if they were to lose their job to be able to pay those bills. There's also, a lot of people who have an ongoing concern about paying rent. And those concerns have decreased slightly since the furlough scheme began in April. However, we're still seeing a significant number of people who have concerns around their ability to meet those expectations. Then when we move on to the next slide, and this is some of the data that Will mentioned around trying to tease out what people would do if they were able to spend or save a windfall. And we like to look at this question to kind of understand how people are really feeling about their economic situation. So overall, we still have more people saying that if they were to receive a windfall, that they would save that rather than spend it. And it's when we actually start to cut that down into the different age groups that we see some really interesting information. So the group who are most likely to use it to repay debts are those in the 35 to 44-year-old age group. This is the age group who are probably most likely to be parents or potentially looking after older family members themselves, potentially have mortgage and other debts that they're having to service. So it makes sense that this is a group of people who would be looking to repay debts, and only around 1 in 10 of them would actually be looking to spend that. When we look at the 18 to 24-year-olds in contrast, this is often a group that is considered very attractive to advertisers. We have only 2% of that group actually saying that they would spend it. And I think what's really interesting here is we've got 22%, or just over 1 in 5 of them, saying that they don't actually know what they would do if they were to receive a windfall equivalent to 1 month's household income. And, you know, I think that's really interesting. There's a lot of reasons that that could be, but you know, overall, this is potentially a group that is living so short term that they can't really get their heads around what they would do with 1 month's income in their hand. And so, you know, how that actually plays out in terms of their decision making, what they're going to spend their money on, and how the next phase of COVID-19 impacts that group will be really important, because so many of them are finishing school, entering the workforce, and so on. And the picture that we have here is that they're really uncertain about their outlook. And then we touched a little bit earlier on shopping in stores and on online spending as well. You know, it's absolutely not surprising that along with the growth in online shopping and people getting delivery more because we've been in lockdown, that we've seen an increase or people using cash less overall. It will be interesting to see, you know, there was the announcement for shops to reopen, and so they did just over a week ago, and we'll start to see data coming through from that in the next couple of weeks. But whether this reduction in the usage of cash is something that sticks around, or once we start going out into bricks and mortar stores, whether people will return to using cash. I think, you know, the demise of cash has been something that's been talked about a lot, and it's kind of an interesting case study to watch whether COVID-19 is going to speed that up, or whether it's just a kind of blip in how our use of cash is changing over time. So I think that's that covers off most of the economic recovery data. Nope, sorry, one more. So I think a lot of us have moved to mandatory remote working during this time. A lot of people during that time have also become full-time carers and have been attempting to homeschool their children. And I think, you know, many a Zoom call has started with conversations about balancing working remotely and looking after children at home. And Will's got some interesting data around how parents and non-parents are feeling about schools reopening. But one of the things we wanted to look at was with the significant impacts on childcare and with our the impact it's also had on our ways of working, is that we expected there to be quite a big difference between how people who are working with children in the household felt about changes they might make to their work life compared to those who didn't. And what we saw surprisingly is that while workers with children in their household are less likely to, or more likely to agree with the statement that they will travel much less for work, in general, they're pretty aligned. And so, you know, one of our takeaways from this is that the impact of being a worker and, you know, what we have to do there is probably impacting people's behaviour more in some areas necessarily than the fact that they have children at home as well. And so when we're thinking about how our lives are going to change and how our habits are going to change going forward, I think it'll be interesting to look at how quickly workplaces start having people return into the office, and how that actually then changes how people shop, etc., because it seems to be more of an indicator than having children for certain aspects. And if we can just move on then to the next slide. And this is one that I really quite like. And this is talking about our behaviours that we want to change going forward, or things that we think we're going to do more of after the lockdown. And what's come through very strongly since we first started tracking this data is support of local businesses and buying local products. But we're also seeing that people are intending to holiday locally, buy more green, take more active part in the local community. We can see there that our women are being a little bit more aspirational with these things, and it will remain to be seen if it's possible to actually deliver across this. But these are definite sentiments that people have about wanting to be more sustainable and take a more local focus in their actions and behaviours after the COVID-19 situation has eased. So I think that's the last slide we have on the economic recovery data. Before we go into some questions, I think Will's going to give you a snapshot of a poll we took this week after some new announcements. So I will hand over to Will. And if you've got any questions, I will be having a look on the chat box, so feel free to send them through.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Amelia. Some really fascinating stuff there. Excuse me. Right. So following the government's announcement this week, I thought it would be quite interesting to share some of the data that we collected in not only our Snap polls that appeared on the BBC, but also delve into some of the data that we have within YouGov Profiles, looking at some of our topical questions to give an idea of direction of travel in terms of where the UK population is going. So, first of all, we ran a poll on the afternoon/evening of the 23rd of June following the government announcement. The specific question was, the government have announced that restaurants, pubs, hairdressers, cinemas, museums, galleries and some other venues will be able to reopen in England from the 4th of July. Do you support or oppose this announcement? So I think there was a follow-up question to that around people being able to meet with another household at a time indoors and being able to visit people. What we've seen in terms of support as opposed to opposition is that the overwhelming majority of the UK population agree or support the relaxing of that particular lockdown measure. 73%, around 3/4 of the population, saying actually it's the households, it's the friends, it's the family, being able to visit them that is important, and we support that. Still a majority, but only backing off to 2/3, saying that we support the reopening of pubs and hairdressers and everything else. But 60% of people agreeing with both. So while there is a majority support for the government move and relaxation of lockdown measures, what we are still seeing is there is a minority, but a consistent minority, that is still opposed to these measures. And what's also interesting is we asked another question on the 23rd of June around whether people support the pace at which government is moving. So the questions here are about, do you think that the government measures have gone too far in relaxing the rules, are balanced, or about right? And we ran a very similar survey actually on the 10th of May, which was then about, well, if you can go to work, you are now allowed to, and you're allowed to do unlimited exercise. Back in the 10th of May, only 1/3 of people said that the government was getting the balance right. And 46% said, well, the changes are going too far. In fact, what we've seen now, following the announcement earlier this week, is a flip in those proportions, where almost half, 47%, are saying the government balance is about right, and about 1/3, 37%, saying, actually, I agree with the pace. So it's interesting, therefore, that what we're seeing is public perception perhaps sort of closing that gap on government policy. But there's a couple of interesting bits and big hot debates around travel. in particular international travel. So what I've done is look into YouGov Profiles. So we've got huge sample sizes here that we're dealing with, sort of around 17,000 people that we've asked these questions of. And what we've asked, I'm showing the results from 3 questions here. So we asked one about whether we thought, whether it was reasonable or unreasonable for countries to refuse UK nationals entry, i.e. close their borders. 74% of people agreed that that was a reasonable thing for a country to do if they feared that the UK might export the disease to them. We've asked a similar question looking at inbound traffic and whether anyone arriving to the UK should be isolated for 14 days. About 2/3 of people agree with that sentiment. More recently, we've also asked a question about, do you support the opening of air bridges or not? So creating corridors exempt from quarantine between popular destinations. So over the summer, that might be France, Spain, Italy, Greece, or even the US, etc. There's not majority support for air bridges at this moment in time, which I thought was quite an interesting finding. Let's go on to another hot topic, and looking at schools. So again, looking at profiles, we've asked a question of how strongly or not do you support the opening of schools? 43% of the population only strongly or somewhat support the opening of schools at this moment in time. Now, as a parent myself, I would have thought that this data would be significantly, I mean, way higher than it is for parents. It's not. It's only, if you look at parents as a group, only 50, they're really on the fence, only 50% of them strongly or somewhat support the reopening of schools at this moment in time. Thinking ahead, thinking into the future. We asked a really interesting question, I think, this is on the 22nd of June. We asked, when it comes to the steps that the government has taken against COVID-19, which of the following comes closest to your view? And it was particularly around lockdown. And essentially the 2 options were, do you think lockdown has been worth it? Or do you think the impact to the economy and society has not been worth the benefit of lockdown? 69% of people say that essentially lockdown has absolutely been worth it in terms of the benefits of lives saved and protecting people. 17% actually say that no, the disruption to the economy and society has not been worth the benefits. If you actually drill into that audience a little more, if those who more strongly agree with that statement, well, they're more likely to be younger, they're more likely to be male, and they're more likely to be based in London. Looking again into the future and what happens if there's a second peak or a second wave. And we asked the question there, if there's a second peak, would you support a stricter version of lockdown than we've just had, lockdown equivalent to that, a more relaxed version, or no lockdown at all? Well, the overwhelming majority are in favour of a lockdown of some sort. What has surprised us is that 43% of people would support an even stricter lockdown than we've had previously if a second wave were to hit the UK. So that's just some of the latest data following the announcement. Before we get on to your questions, and we're just about sort of marking time perfectly to leave 15 minutes for questions, I'd just like to very briefly touch on what's next for YouGov's COVID tracking. So we run these trackers in blocks of 8 weeks. We're coming to the end of our second block here. And as we go into block 3, which starts in early July, what we're actually doing is, again, similarly we did between block 1 and block 2. We're evolving the data that we collect. Some questions are now redundant. They've run their time. They were pertinent at the start of wave 2. We're going to retire them. There's some new data that we're going to start collecting around people's comfort with doing certain things, visiting places, or engaging in certain activities. That I think is crucial as lockdown measures ease and ease and ease, and it's understanding, will people return to the pubs in their droves on the 4th of July, and things like that. So that's the direction of travel for us. If you do have any feedback or questions that you would like asked, then please do get in touch either with your local account team or info@yougov.com. We can't promise to field every single question, but where we think that there is majority client support for it, we will do our best to add it. Right. So before we close, we'd like to get on to the really interesting bit. I can see that there's been lots of questions coming in. Some of them I've already answered directly in the chat, but Amelia has been fastidiously going through them while I've been buying her some time. So Amelia, what have you found?
Okay, so some of them you answered before they were, after they were asked, so that is great. I think, Will, we didn't cover anything specifically around changes in purchasing behaviour for, large purchases, holidays, real estate, that type of thing. But I know we've been looking at information on that. Overall, what would you say people's outlook is on that? Are we seeing that people are spending money on those large purchases in the future, or has that dried up?
Sure. So, I mean, what we've got actually within our brand index tool is looking across 37 sectors, whether people are in market over a given period of time. We've got that data sitting in the tool. I'm very happy to share elements of that, or if you are a subscriber, to grant full access to that data. What that looks at is, so for example, if we talk about clothing, we're looking at a purchase window over the next 90 days. If we're looking at something like international travel, we're looking at or holidays, we're looking at a window of in-market over the next 6 or 12 months. So I'm afraid I don't have those numbers to hand, but we can certainly share some or elements of that after this call.
Yep. Fabulous. Sorry, my phrasing on that was quite unusual. I didn't actually expect you to just be able to rattle off the data on the top of your head. I think we've also had some questions come through around the responses to the lockdown relaxation, and also, whether we would go into a second lockdown, and people have asked if those results are different by age group. We haven't cut them by age group for today, but we absolutely have the ability to cut those by age group. And I think just looking at some of the other data points that we have, which is that it was predominantly young people who felt that the lockdown had potentially not been worth it. I guess the expectation would be that those who were keen to see an even stricter second lockdown would be more likely those who are in the older age groups, more likely to be female, and those who we've seen all throughout the COVID crisis as being more concerned and more likely to be following the lockdown rules.
Fantastic. I've seen a couple in here that I'm keen to look at. There was one relatively early on from Samantha, looking at, in particular, the scenes from Bournemouth Beach, and from Anfield. So looking at large gatherings of people. I don't actually have any data on that, but while we've been on this call, what I have asked for is from our YouGov Direct team, who are running a survey at 5:30 this afternoon. They will put a question out in regards to that. So YouGov Direct is our latest innovation. We get about 1,000 responses inside 3 minutes. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a question out there, and Samantha will have data for you, hopefully well before 6 o'clock this evening on that. But it's a really interesting point on can we, well, some people are saying sort of, support relaxation, but then they're, going to the beach and potentially looking at, removing completely social distancing rules. That's a really interesting one. The other question that I picked up on looks at our economic recovery questions, particular in comparison with the crash in 2008, 2009. The reason that we've asked the questions as we have is so that we can maintain the benchmark data and the tracking data that we have. Our tracking data on economic confidence goes all the way back to the last financial crisis. So we can absolutely pull out some of the benchmarking data there, and we can absolutely do that with you after this call. Amelia.
Okay, so another couple of questions that we've had is kind of around how people are feeling about the reopening. And we've had some questions both around how people are feeling about the workplace and potentially returning to the workplace, and also just, returning to bricks and mortars store. We will continue to be tracking people's opinions and their feelings on this over time as things open up. So I think, what we've seen in the data so far is that people are feeling quite comfortable about the speed, or increasingly comfortable about the speed in which things are opening up. What we are doing is adding a lot of questions to our syndicated data to be able to capture some of these nuances around some of the changing guidelines in social distancing and the different types of businesses that are being able to open up. We also have a tracking product called Culture Index, which looks particularly at things like galleries, historical sites, and so on. And that's an industry that's been particularly impacted over the last 3 months by the shutdown, and they've asked us to look specifically at, how comfortable do people actually feel about going back to these types of attractions, and how much do they feel that the burden is on the attraction themselves to make it safe versus, personal responsibility. So we'll be looking more into that as things open up and people are actually having to make those decisions and make a choice about whether they want to stay inside or whether they want to go back to some pre-COVID normalcy. So we can have some more information to share on that in the future as well too.
Fantastic.
And then
sorry, Amelia, off to you.
No, you keep going.
Okay, and apologies because I've been sort of busy looking at some data in the background. So I hope you haven't answered this one already. There was one interesting one in from Laura. Do you have any data on new hobbies, activities taking up during lockdown? The answer is yes. Yes, we do. What we exercise is the obvious one. And what we have seen, we track it, and we've tracked it back since July 19. Of how many times a day do you exercise? What we saw is when lockdown started on the 23rd of March, you suddenly saw a massive spike in people saying that they were exercising more regularly. What we've seen as lockdown has progressed is that actually the numbers of people claiming to regularly exercise have steadily declined as people who've become less enthusiastic about it. But there's other, sort of interesting ones as well, like taking up jigsaws has been another hobby. We do have quite a rich seam of data on that. Again, we can share some of that, or you're more than welcome to look into profiles to gain that. There was another question from let me go and find it, from M. Why do you think there was a sharp decline in those with kids in the household wanting to work from home post-COVID? I think it shot down to 35%. Don't have anything quantitatively on this. What I do have qualitatively is what we've heard from our panelists, is that while earlier on in lockdown, actually working from home was a bit of a blessing. People didn't have to commute anymore. They gained a couple of hours in the day. What we're seeing is actually those numbers beginning to wane, and people actually can't wait to get back into the office in some areas, especially those with children. And they actually correlate very highly with those who can't wait for schools to open. Suggests pressure on workspace, on time, on having thinking time and quiet time, and not being interrupted during work. So I think there's some sort of quantitative data we've got indicating that. We've got some qualitative data that also helps to support that. Amelia, I think we've probably got time for a couple more, if there's anything interesting on that.
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of questions that have come through around the windfall data that we showed, and a question around when we asked people whether they were going to save it, if we split that up at all. So Ken has asked about that. And we don't actually ask that, but I think, we do ask the people if they want to invest it in the stock market. Now, that's obviously quite different and quite a bit riskier to saving it for pension. But I don't think we have any data, Will, that kind of breaks it down into that sort of short-term saving versus long-term saving. I think probably the best way to get to an approximation of that would potentially be to have a look at different age groups as well, and have a look at what some of the expenditure of those groups are. But yeah, we've just looked more generally at whether or not people would be able to spend it, meaning that they didn't feel like they had a need for it for bills or for a rainy day, save it, spend it on bills, or play the stock market on it is our riskiest option there in terms of how people might use that windfall.
Yeah, absolutely right. We unfortunately we haven't broken down what saving actually means, whether that be putting in a bank account for a short or a long amount of time, or indeed just holding it in cash and putting it away in the back of a drawer. We don't break data down on that at all, I'm afraid. Jason, do you have a breakdown on the return to the workplace and the geography of it? The short answer to that is yes, we do. Everything that we have here at YouGov, we're able to break down in endless demographics. Looking as we've now got sizable sample sizes, we can actually get down to relatively small geographies with our data. I'm afraid I don't have it to hand, so apologies for that. But yes, we can break everything that we report by almost any variable that you can think of, sample sizes permitting.
And then we just had a question as well from Mimi around if we will have a session about changes in media consumption. And I actually would say that today's probably the lightest on in media consumption that we've been, because we just haven't seen that much change in it over the last few weeks. But if you have a look on our website at our previous webinars, there's definitely been more discussion of media consumption there. And again, we can get very granular in terms of that media consumption. So if there's something in particular that you're looking for, don't hesitate to get in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We're at time, so I'm going to wrap it up. First of all, huge thanks to Amelia for the really interesting analysis from today, and for your answer to questions. But most of all, huge thanks to you, our clients, for attending today, and for the enormous number of questions that we've got. As I said, we will be circulating a recording of this webinar and the charts afterwards. But if you do have any further questions, please don't fail to get in touch with your local account team or email at us at info@yougov.com. So it's goodbye from me. It's goodbye from Amelia.
Yes, thanks, Will.
And we hope you have a great afternoon. Goodbye.